There is a cruel kind of injustice in being the one who survives. For decades, the world looked at Barry Gibb and saw glamour, fame, and a voice so unmistakable it could turn heartbreak into melody. They saw the satin suits, the disco lights, the screaming crowds, the impossible success of the Bee Gees. They saw a legend. But what they did not see was the private cost of staying alive long enough to outlive the people who built that legend with him. Barry Gibb was born on the 1st of September 1946, and over the course of one extraordinary lifetime, he helped create one of the most successful groups in popular music history. The Bee Gees were not just a band, they were a bloodline. Barry, Robin, and Maurice were not assembled by a manager, a label, or a television audition. They were brothers before they were icons, a family before they were a brand. That is what makes Barry's story so much heavier than people realize. When a normal band breaks apart, it is a professional loss. When the Bee Gees were torn apart, it was personal in the most devastating way possible. The public usually remembers the music first, the harmonies, the falsetto, the soundtrack of an era. Stayin' Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, songs so woven into culture that they almost feel immortal. The Bee Gees were eventually inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and their influence became impossible to deny. Even the Recording Academy recognized their lasting impact with major honors, including the Grammy Legend Award. But awards have a strange way of freezing success in gold, while doing absolutely nothing to preserve the people who earned it. Trophies can commemorate greatness. They cannot stop loss. And that loss came for Barry in waves. In January 2003, Maurice Gibb died suddenly at just 53 years old. It was a shattering blow, not just to the Bee Gees as a musical institution, but to Barry as an older brother who had spent virtually his entire life with Maurice at his side. At the 2003 Grammy ceremony, when Barry and Robin accepted the Bee Gees Legend Award, the moment was overshadowed by grief. It was not a victory lap. It was a public mourning. The world saw two surviving brothers on stage. But what made the image unforgettable was the absence standing beside them. Maurice should have been there. He wasn't, and everybody knew it. For some families, one devastating loss is enough to change every remaining year. For Barry Gibb, it was not the last. In 2012, Robin Gibb died after a long and deeply public health struggle. And with Robin's death, something even more final happened. The Bee Gees, as a living brotherhood, were truly over. Not paused, not retired, not resting, over. Barry was no longer one-third of the trio that had conquered the world. He became the last keeper of something that could never be reconstructed. You can replace a lineup in many bands. You cannot replace brothers. You cannot recreate childhood, shared hunger, family arguments, private jokes, or the instinctive harmony that comes from having grown up under the same roof. When Robin died, Barry did not simply lose another collaborator. He lost one of the last living witnesses to his own beginning. That is the part of Barry Gibb's life that makes his story so haunting. The tragedy is not only that death visited his family. The tragedy is that Barry lived long enough to carry all of it. He carried the memory of Maurice. He carried the memory of Robin. And in later public tributes, even while being celebrated for a career that most artists could never dream of, he still spoke like a man aware of who was missing from the room. In 2023, when Barry was honored by the Kennedy Center, he said he wished his brothers were there to share the moment. That single thought says more than any dramatic headline ever could. Even at the summit of recognition, his triumph was still incomplete, because maybe that is Barry Gibb's real story. Not just fame, not just genius, not just survival, but the unbearable emotional paradox of survival, to still be here, to still be applauded, to still hear the songs, to still watch audiences celebrate music that was built with voices that are now gone. For millions of fans, Bee Gees songs are memories of love, youth, dance floors, weddings, and radio summers. For Barry, those same songs are also echoes. They are reminders of brothers who once stood inches away from him, singing into the same microphone, shaping the same sound, sharing the same destiny. And that is why Barry Gibb's reality is far more heartbreaking than most people understand. Because sometimes, the saddest role in any legendary story is not the one who fell first. It is the one left standing at the end. Before Barry Gibb became the last surviving Bee Gee, he was simply the oldest brother in a family that seemed to breathe music before it ever understood fame. His father, Hugh Gibb, was a working musician, and his mother, Barbara, held the family together through constant movement, uncertainty, and ambition. Barry was born on the Isle of Man on the 1st of September 1946. Robin and Maurice followed in 1949. Long before the world knew them as icons, they were just three boys growing up inside the same noise, the same hunger, and the same dream. What makes Barry's story so emotionally devastating is that the Bee Gees were never manufactured in a studio boardroom. They were built inside a household. Their harmonies were not invented by producers searching for a marketable sound. They were formed in childhood, in local performances, family pressure, and the strange intimacy only brothers can understand. Britannica notes that the brothers performed together in Manchester in the 1950s before emigrating to Australia, where the path toward becoming the Bee Gees truly took shape. That origin matters, because when people later watched the group fracture and fade, they were not just seeing a band change, they were watching a family absorb damage in public. In Australia, the brothers sharpened the act that would eventually change their lives. The Recording Academy lists the Bee Gees as having formed in Brisbane in 1958, but that simple date hides the years of grind behind it. Success did not arrive as a miracle. It came through persistence, reinvention, and the relentless belief that the brothers belonged somewhere bigger than the small stages they started on. When they returned to England in the mid-1960s, they were no longer just talented kids from a musical family. They were determined, polished, and ready to test whether blood harmony could conquer the world. And for a while, it did. Their early international hits, including Massachusetts' "I've Gotta Get a Message to You" and "I Started a Joke," helped establish them as something more than a passing act. They were sophisticated, emotional, unmistakable. Then came the reinvention that made them immortal in pop culture. After a difficult period and several lean years, Main Course pushed them into a new era, and Jive Talkin' announced that the Bee Gees were not trapped in the past. Then, Saturday Night Fever turned their music into a global event. According to the Grammys, the group recorded 30 top 40 hits and 9 no.1 singles, while the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack became one of the defining pop achievements of the era. But that is where Barry Gibb's life becomes more tragic than glamorous. The bigger the Bee Gees became, the easier it was for the public to believe success had solved everything. It hadn't. Even in their rise, there were tensions, brief splits, and the emotional strain that comes from brothers trying to share one identity while still fighting to protect their own. Britannica notes that the group split briefly after Odessa in 1969. To outsiders, that may sound like a routine creative dispute, but in a family band, every disagreement cuts deeper. An argument is never only about music. It becomes about loyalty, childhood roles, ego, and love. And then there was Andy. He was the youngest Gibb brother, the beautiful golden child, who seemed to carry the same family gift in a different key. He was not one of the Bee Gees, but he was still part of the emotional architecture of Barry's life. Andy became a star in his own right, but his life unraveled under addiction, financial collapse, and personal turmoil. Biography.com reports that Andy Gibb died in Oxford on the 10th of March, 1988, at just 30 years old, from myocarditis. That loss matters profoundly in Barry's story, because it means the Gibb family tragedy did not begin in the 2000s. The shadow had already entered the house years earlier. Barry had already learned what it meant to lose a brother before the world was finished applauding the family name. That is what makes Barry Gibb's success feel so haunted in retrospect. When the Bee Gees stood at the top of music history, winning Grammys, dominating charts, and defining an era, the foundation beneath all that brilliance was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The public saw polish. Barry saw people he loved carrying fame in very different ways, and not all of them surviving it. By the time Maurice and Robin were lost years later, Barry was not encountering grief for the first time. He was encountering it again and again and again. That may be why Barry's later reflections carry such unusual weight. In a 2021 CBS News interview, he said he could not bear to watch the Bee Gees documentary all the way through because revisiting the loss of his family was too painful. That tells you everything about the real story behind the legend. For the audience, the Bee Gees are nostalgia. For Barry, they are memory mixed with absence. They are proof that some of the most joyful songs ever recorded were built by men whose shared story would end in heartbreak. And maybe that is the cruelest truth of Part 2. Before Barry Gibb became the man standing alone, he had already spent decades building a kingdom out of brotherhood. Every hit made the bond seem indestructible. Every success made the family look untouchable. But beneath the applause, the tragedy had already begun to right itself. And Barry, whether he knew it or not, was already being prepared for the loneliest role of all, the one who would remember everything after everyone else was gone. By the time the world began to treat the Bee Gees like untouchable royalty, Barry Gibb had already learned a truth fame can never protect you from. Success does not make a family safe. It only makes their suffering more visible. The first devastating fracture in the Gibb family story came with Andy. He was not officially a Bee Gee, but he was still Barry's younger brother, still part of the same bloodline, still carrying the same musical spark that made the Gibb name feel almost supernatural. Andy became a star with his own run of hits, his own fan hysteria, his own future that seemed limitless. But his life spiraled under pressure, addiction, and instability, and he died in 1988 at only 30 years old. For Barry, that loss was more than a private wound. It was the first undeniable proof that being a Gibb could come with a terrible cost. The family that had given the world so much joy was already beginning to break, and yet the public rarely sees tragedy when the music is still playing. That is what makes Barry Gibb's life so emotionally brutal in hindsight. Even after Andy was gone, the Bee Gees continued to stand as symbols of elegance, endurance, and musical genius. They kept performing, they kept writing, they kept carrying the weight of an identity that had become larger than any one person. From the outside, it looked like resilience. From Barry's side of the glass, it may have felt more like survival, because once a family has already buried one son, every remaining triumph acquires a shadow. Every standing ovation is heard a little differently. Every reunion is also a reminder of who is missing. Then came 2003. Maurice Gibb died suddenly on the 12th of January, 2003, at age 53, after complications connected to a twisted intestine. The shock of his death was devastating not only because he was still young, but because Maurice had always been one of the emotional anchors of the Bee Gees. He was the brother in the middle, the one who often seemed to hold the structure together when tensions rose. His death did not feel like the end of an era in the usual celebrity sense. It felt abrupt, unnatural, unfinished. The Bee Gees were supposed to be a living thing, a brotherhood still breathing. And suddenly, one of the central voices was just gone. For Barry, that loss was catastrophic in a way few audiences could ever fully understand. Maurice was not just a bandmate he had known for years. Maurice was part of his entire life story from the beginning. Childhood, migration, hunger, obscurity, fame, backlash, reinvention, redemption. Maurice had been there for all of it. When someone shares your whole origin, losing them does something terrifying. It damages your memory of yourself. It leaves parts of your own life stranded in silence, because one of the only people who truly remembers those moments is no longer here to remember them with you. That is the kind of grief that does not merely hurt, it disorients. And still, the story was not finished punishing Barry Gibb. Because Maurice's death was not simply the loss of a beloved brother, it was also the moment Barry had to confront something he may never have wanted to say aloud. The Bee Gees could continue to be honored, remembered, replayed, and celebrated, but they could never again be whole. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. Not in the way only brothers understand. The machinery of legacy could keep moving. The songs could keep streaming. The awards could keep coming. But the living heartbeat of the group had been permanently altered. What remained was no longer the same organism. It was memory trying to impersonate life. And that is where Barry's tragedy becomes deeper than ordinary grief. Most people lose loved ones in private. Barry lost them, while the whole world still expected the soundtrack to keep playing. He had to stand inside one of the most beloved catalogs in popular music, while carrying sorrow that audiences could applaud over but never remove. Songs that made strangers dance were becoming monuments to people he could no longer reach. The irony is almost unbearable. The Bee Gees gave the world "Stayin' Alive," but Barry was discovering the emotional burden of being the one who stayed alive longest. Years later, Barry admitted he could not bring himself to watch the Bee Gees documentary all the way through because he could not handle watching the rest of my family. That one confession reveals more than any tabloid headline ever could. It tells you that the music may be timeless, but the memories are still raw. It tells you that surviving is not the same as healing. And it tells you that for Barry Gibb, the Bee Gees are not just a glorious chapter in music history. They are also an archive of loss. So, by the end of this chapter, Barry was no longer just a legend. He was a brother, carrying the unbearable realization that the family miracle which built his life was beginning to disappear piece by piece. And the worst was still to come. If Maurice's death shattered the structure, Robin's death destroyed the illusion that Barry Gibb might somehow still hold the old world together. After Maurice died in 2003, there was still one surviving brother beside Barry. However broken the family felt, there was still a shared witness to the past. Robin was still there. He still carried the same childhood, the same harmonies, the same memories of hunger, ambition, rivalry, and triumph. But in May 2012, Robin Gibb died after a long battle with cancer and related complications. With Robin's death, Barry did not just lose another brother. He became the last surviving Bee Gee. That was not merely a biographical detail. It was a devastating transformation of identity. The group that had once felt inseparable in the public imagination now existed only in memory, recordings, and grief. That phrase, "the last Bee Gee," sounds poetic to the audience. To Barry, it must have felt like a sentence. Because what does it really mean to be the last surviving member of something that was built from blood? It means every song becomes heavier. Every interview becomes an act of remembrance. Every celebration comes with a silence underneath it. The world hears legacy. Barry hears absence. And unlike ordinary loss, this kind of loss never stays private, because the Bee Gees' music is still everywhere. Every time "How Deep Is Your Love" plays, every time "Stayin' Alive" returns in a film, a concert, or a memory, Barry is not just hearing a hit, he is hearing voices that used to stand beside him in real time. That is what makes Barry Gibb's tragedy so much more brutal than a dramatic headline can capture. The pain is not only in what he lost, it is in what remained. He remained. The music remained. The adoration remained. The applause remained. But the brothers did not. And when grief arrives in that form, success can start to feel strangely cruel, because all the honors in the world cannot restore the people who made those honors possible. Years after Robin's death, Barry spoke with a kind of honesty that revealed how deep the wound still runs. In a CBS News interview, he said he could not watch the Bee Gees documentary all the way through because it was too painful to watch the rest of his family. That is not the language of a man who has neatly moved on. That is the confession of someone for whom memory is still dangerous. It tells you the grief never became a closed chapter. It simply became part of daily life. And yet, Barry kept going. That may be the most heartbreaking part of all. He kept performing. He kept showing up. He kept carrying a catalog that helped define generations. In 2014, CBS described him as the remaining BG, back on tour with his son Stephen after the deaths of Maurice and Robin. On the surface, that sounds uplifting. And in one sense, it is. But there is another way to hear it. A father and son on stage where once there had been brothers. A living continuation, yes, but also a visible reminder that the original circle had been broken forever. This is where Barry Gibb's story stops being just a music story and becomes something more universal. It becomes a story about survival that does not feel victorious. About outliving people who seemed essential to your existence. About standing in the spotlight while privately carrying a cemetery of memories. For the fans, Barry Gibb is a legend still standing. For Barry, standing may have never been the hard part. The hard part was standing after Maurice, standing after Robin, standing while the world celebrates songs that now sound, to him, like conversations with ghosts. And that is why his reality feels so haunting. Because by this point in the story, Barry was no longer just mourning his brothers. He was living inside their echo. Now, as Barry Gibb moves through the late chapter of a life that began on the 1st of September 1946, the tragedy of his story is no longer hidden behind youth, fame, or momentum. He is still celebrated as one of popular music's great survivors and architects, a 9-time Grammy winner and a 2023 Kennedy Center honoree. But that kind of recognition carries a painful contradiction. The older Barry gets, the more the world praises the legacy, and the more impossible it becomes to ignore who is missing from it. That is why the image of Barry in his later years feels so emotionally powerful. To the public, he represents endurance. To anyone looking more closely, he also represents what endurance costs. The Bee Gees were never just a hit-making machine. They were a family phenomenon, built from the voices of brothers who turned shared blood into a global sound. So every modern tribute, every standing ovation, every carefully edited career retrospective carries two meanings at once: celebration on the surface and absence underneath. That is the emotional wound at the center of Barry Gibb's life. In 2023, when the Kennedy Center honored Barry Gibb, the moment should have felt like pure triumph. It was one of the highest cultural recognitions an artist can receive. Yet even there, the emotional truth of his life remained unchanged. In the official Kennedy Center feature, Barry spoke openly about wishing his brothers could have been there to share the moment. That single sentiment says more than any sensational headline ever could. Even at the height of recognition, his joy was still divided by grief. And maybe that is what makes Barry's story so heartbreaking in the deepest sense. He did not disappear after tragedy. He did not collapse in public. He kept going. He kept singing. He kept carrying the songs. CBS reported in 2014 that he returned to touring as the remaining BG, joined not by his brothers, but by his son Stephen. On paper, that sounds inspiring, and it is. But emotionally, it also feels like a visible reminder that time had rewritten the stage. The family circle that once defined his life could never be restored. What makes this even sadder is that Barry himself has never spoken like someone untouched by the past. In his 2021 CBS News interview, he admitted that the Bee Gees documentary was too painful for him to watch all the way through because, as he put it, he could not bear watching the rest of my family. That is not nostalgia. That is grief still alive in the present tense. It tells you that the music may have become timeless, but the losses never became easy. So when people look at Barry Gibb now, they often see a legend who made it through everything. But that is only half the truth. The other half is far more devastating. He made it through, yes, but he made it through without Maurice, without Robin, and after losing Andy too. Survival gave him more years, more honors, more applause. It also gave him the burden of memory, the burden of being the one left to carry the full emotional weight of what the Bee Gees once were. That is the real ending of Barry Gibb's story. Not just the fame, not just the genius, not just the awards, but the unbearable price of being the one who remains. Because sometimes the most heartbreaking figure in a legendary family is not the one who dies too soon. It is the one who lives long enough to stand alone, smiling through the applause, while hearing every song as an echo of the people he loved most. There is something almost impossible about Barry Gibb's life now, not because he became famous, not because he helped create one of the most recognizable sounds in modern music, not even because he outlived an era that once seemed untouchable. What feels almost impossible is that he had to keep living after the voices that shaped his entire world went silent. For most people, memory is a comfort. For Barry Gibb, memory can feel like a room he enters at his own risk, because every beautiful memory carries a second edge. Every childhood flashback leads back to Robin, to Maurice, to Andy, to the young brothers who once stood together before the world knew their names, believing that music would save them, never imagining it would one day become the very thing that preserved their loss forever. That is the hidden cruelty of Barry Gibb's legacy. The songs survived, the harmonies survived, the fame survived, but the family did not. And when that happens, legacy stops feeling like a reward. It starts feeling like a museum. A beautiful one, yes, a glorious one, but still a place filled with the past, filled with voices that can be heard but never answered. Barry does not just perform songs. He walks through emotional ruins and the public mistakes for nostalgia. That is why his story cuts deeper than most celebrity tragedies. This is not simply the story of a star who suffered losses. It is the story of a man whose greatest success is permanently tied to the people he can no longer stand beside. Every Bee Gees tribute carries that contradiction. Every standing ovation contains that wound. Audiences hear brilliance. Barry hears history. And history, for him, is not abstract. It has faces. It has names. It has brothers. There is also something profoundly lonely about being remembered as the last one. People say it with admiration. The last Bee Gee, the surviving brother, the keeper of the flame. But titles like that carry a terrible emotional weight, because hidden inside every one of them is the same truth. Everyone else is gone. He did not choose that role. He inherited it through grief. He became the final witness to a miracle that could never happen again. And perhaps that is why Barry Gibb's later life feels so haunting. He is not a forgotten legend. He is not a fallen star. He is something sadder, and in many ways more powerful. A man still loved by millions, still honored, still celebrated, yet forced to carry a version of success that can never feel complete. The public often imagines tragedy as collapse, as scandal, as visible destruction. But Barry's tragedy is quieter than that. It is endurance. It is waking up year after year as the custodian of songs that once belonged to a living brotherhood. It is smiling when people celebrate music that probably breaks your heart in ways they will never fully understand. It is accepting awards, receiving tributes, hearing the applause, and still knowing that the people you most want beside you will never walk into the room again. That is not a dramatic invention. That is the emotional truth at the center of Barry Gibb's life. Because in the end, the cruelest part of survival is not merely living through loss. It is carrying the echo of that loss into every beautiful thing that remains. and Barry Gibb remains. He remains as the voice. He remains as the memory. He remains as the final link to one of music's most extraordinary families. But remaining is not the same as being whole. That is why his story is beyond heartbreaking. Not because he had nothing, but because he had something so rare, so intimate, so irreplaceable, and lived long enough to watch it disappear piece by piece. And when the music plays now, the world still hears the Bee Gees. But Barry, perhaps more than anyone else alive, hears the silence between them. In the end, Barry Gibb's story is not truly about fame. Fame is only the surface. The real story is what remained after the lights dimmed, after the applause faded, after the world turned a family into a legend, and then left one man to carry that legend alone. Because that is the part people rarely talk about. They talk about the records. They talk about the falsetto. They talk about the Bee Gees as icons, as hitmakers, as immortals of popular music. But immortality in art can come with a terrible human price. The songs may live forever. The voices may echo forever. The name may endure forever. Yet the man at the center of it all still has to wake up in the real world. In a life where Robin is gone, Maurice is gone, Andy is gone, and the brotherhood that once gave meaning to every stage, every studio, and every triumph can now only exist in memory. That is what makes Barry Gibb's reality so devastating. He did not just lose people he loved. He lost the only people on earth who understood the full weight of the journey. Only they knew what it felt like to be boys before they were stars. Only they knew the hunger, the fear, the ambition, the family tensions, the private jokes, the shared pain, the miracle of building a sound no one else could replicate. And now Barry carries all of that alone. He is not just preserving songs. He is preserving witnesses. He is preserving a world that died with the people who helped create it. That is a burden no award can lighten. And maybe that is why his life feels so much sadder than the public realizes. Because, from a distance, Barry Gibb looks like a survivor. But survival is not always a happy ending. Sometimes survival is just a longer form of heartbreak. Sometimes survival means becoming the keeper of memories too sacred to escape and too painful to relive. Sometimes survival means hearing joy and feeling grief at the exact same time. That is Barry Gibb's tragedy. The world gave him legacy. Time gave him loneliness. Music made him immortal. But survival made him solitary. And perhaps that is the cruelest twist of all. The Bee Gees gave the world songs about love, devotion, longing, and staying alive. But Barry Gibb, the brother who stayed alive the longest, became the one forced to prove what those words really cost. So when people look at him now, they should not only see a legend, they should see a man who endured the unimaginable, a man who kept singing after loss, a man who kept standing after the family circle was broken forever, a man whose voice still carries beauty even when his life carries absence. That is why Barry Gibb's story will always be more than a celebrity biography. It is a story about what happens when love, family, genius, and grief all become inseparable. It is a story about the unbearable cost of being the one left behind. And in that sense, Barry Gibb may be one of the most heartbreaking figures in music history. Not because he was forgotten, not because he failed, but because he remembered, because he survived, because he stayed. And because sometimes the saddest man in the room is not the one the world stopped loving, but the one the world still applauds, while he quietly carries everything it took to get there.